All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about Kimberlé Crenshaw's essay, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. And so her general thesis here is to talk about how identity politics is important when it comes to recognizing the different kinds of experiences that women of color kind of endure and face in our society. And that specifically when it comes to violence, domestic violence situations, their experiences are going to be qualitatively different from what white women experience. So just because someone can all exist in a group together, right, there still can be differences. So not all women experience reality or have similar experiences just because they're women, right? Of course, there are some shared experiences, but when it comes to the different dimensions of race and gender and class in our society, right, that's going to cause there to be intra-group differences in terms of how they experience and navigate reality. And so there's kind of a push against identity politics that she's responding to in her essay, where she says that identity politics isn't causing divides, it's not ignoring what's happening for people, it's basically identifying how people have different kinds of experiences, even if they do belong to the same group. And also it can be, when we think about these categories of identifying, for example, as a Black woman or identifying as a woman of color in general, right? These categories can be empowering and it can be a source of strength. So to kind of ignore it is ignoring reality and further rendering women of color as being invisible. And so in order to understand the violence that exists for women, specifically women of color in our society, she breaks it down into understanding it through structural intersectionality and political intersectionality. So in this video, I'm going to focus more on the structural intersectionality, and then in the next video, I'll talk about political intersectionality. So with structural intersectionality, we're thinking about domestic violence and violence in general against women of color in terms of how it impacts them through the various structures and institutions of society. So how do race and class, right? How is that impacted when it comes to experiencing violence and needing to go somewhere to report it, or interacting with the legal system, or interacting with the police, right? These are examples of institutions. And so the first type of structural intersectionality she talks about is its relationship with battering, with being, for example, in a domestically violent situation. And she says that she has done some research, and specifically with the battered women's shelters in LA, and she says that the vast majority of women there are women of color, and the vast majority of these women of color are underemployed or unemployed. And so that's not a coincidence. She talks about how race and class are very telling when it comes to the poverty that people experience or the distribution of resources in our society. And she says that women of color are disproportionately living in poverty, and women of color and poverty are more highly correlated than being a white woman, for example, or being a white man. And that's just a reality that we have to experience and think about when we're talking about violence, because that impacts the resources that people have access to. Sometimes, people might say, oh, your husband's beating you up, why don't you go to your mom's house, or why don't you go to a friend's house, right? You can just escape it by doing that. And she says that's not that easy. If you are a woman of color and your resources or the other people could potentially be other people of color, and they have less resources, then it's less likely that you have somewhere to go to, that you have somewhere safe to go to as well. So your resources are limited, and when you live in a society where race and class are telling of these resources, of these socioeconomic resources, then obviously the steps to escaping or transcending this domestic violence is going to be much more difficult. And she also says that there can be cultural barriers, right, where someone may feel ashamed of talking about or trying to leave their husband or something because it's, looked down upon their cultures, or they might be living in a multi-generational household where they don't have any time to themselves. Or there can be linguistic barriers, and there can also be nationality status barriers, where she says that someone who's an immigrant, who's not a US citizen, is going to have a much more difficult time, dealing with this domestic violence, because they might have to choose between their, having to be deported and versus staying with their abusive partner. And so what do you do, right? They're kind of stuck in this situation where they have to choose between staying in their abusive environment or potentially being deported to a situation that can be really violent too. So these are just examples of how the structural realities of how a woman can be a woman of color can be battered, and there are all these barriers for her, right? There's all these obstacles for her. And she also talks about it in terms of rape situations where, unfortunately, rape crisis centers, with the distribution of funds, they're often put towards legal court cases. So having an advocate, for example, go with you to court. And she says that there are so many cases of rape that don't necessarily go to court. And that unfortunately happens for situations with women of color where they might, go to one of these agencies, but their case may not make it to court. And that can be really difficult, especially if the resources for these centers are primarily being allocated to court costs. And Crenshaw says that these resources should be redistributed when it comes to referrals and finding, helping people in the community before it even gets to that court process. So those are just some examples of the structural intersectionality of race and gender and domestic violence.